Welcome classic rock fans to an episode of Classic Album Review, where classic albums are excavated and explored, and today we're looking at Nursery Cryme by Genesis. This album is a phantasmagoria of sound that evokes an atmosphere of sinister Victoriana. One of course is reminded of the Beatles' own foray into our top-hatted and industrial past with their being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. But whereas the latter embodies a swirling psychedelia and mawkish sentimentality reminiscent of a Victorian fair, this album, especially the track The Musical Box, draws its influences from the more Gothic elements of 19th century literature and fairy tale. Peter Gabriel has said, of course, that is indeed where its influences lie. The music of Genesis is imbued with a hymnal English pastoral sensibility, beloved of geography teachers everywhere. And on this record they create a fanciful world that has a somewhat repressed, almost psychotic rendering of childhood, fantasy and myth. It's an intriguing album full of whimsical tales and themes and ideas and instrumental indulgences, not to mention oodles of charm, of course. Let's not forget Keith Emerson describes this album as incredible. The Musical Box and Return of the Giant Hogweed dominate side one of this album, and as Peter Gabriel fluctuates between sheer brilliance and preposterousness in one fell swoop. Nevertheless, it's definitely a step up from the pastoral folkiness of the Trespass album. And classic rock has said of this very album, with new personnel, the group would go on to take the still infant progressive rock scene to new heights. Nursery Cryme is full of wonders, and one wonders what on earth they must have been thinking as we get this interesting narratives of murder, myth and toxic vegetation. Collins' influence is clearly felt, and Steve Hackett's playing, in the words of Chris Welsh's excellent book, combines both melodic and violent outbursts, adding to these outrageously imaginative and eccentric numbers. Although Rolling Stone's Richard Cromlin voices his displeasure at the overall sound of this record and the mix, he says it's a murky and distant stew that at best bubbles quietly. Although despite its limitations in terms of sound, BBC Music has gone on to praise its snappy drums and Hackett's armoury of tapping and swelling techniques that really broaden the palette of this band, giving Tony Banks more room for his Delius light organ filigrees. It was about at this time that Peter Gabriel felt that this band lacked stage presence and needed a strong dose of theatricality, acting out songs with the help of an array of costumes and dodgy haircuts. He would stalk menacingly around the front, in front of the audience, while the rest of the band haunched over their instruments, providing a rather potent contrast. Of course, before the songs he would regale them with these interesting stories, these little narratives. There was hardly rock and roll, it wasn't exactly grand funk or the Stooges, more Charterhouse than Full House. In fact, several critics have suggested they draw heavily upon this public school upbringing. I mean, not Collins and Hackett, of course. One critic has said that they twist upper middle class cliches into surreal and sinister scenarios. Serial prog basher John Peel would go and see them about this time, and he would say they were getting into a few minutes into their set, and I would just say, oh please stop. Well, they must have seen something of value in this band even then, because the band had got in for a BBC session during the I think just about the time the Nursery Cryme album had come out. I think they recorded about 4 songs, and they recorded 4 songs in stereo, which was quite rare at this time, as most BBC sessions actually recorded in mono. Just prior to this album, of course, we get the departure of guitar player Anthony Phillips and drummer John Mayhew, and a change of direction was required to realise this band's rather odd and grandiose visions. The previous album, Trespass, had been wrapped in this folky charm, more Crosby, Stills and Nash than King Crimson, but I think it's fair to say a marker was put down with this album as they assumed the mantle of purveyors of a very English rock fantasy. They of course retreated to Luxford House to regale the world with Nursery Cryme, a proggy rendering of Greek myth and 19th century shaggy dog stories, tales of English rural life and vegetation gone wild. This band, rather than the twisted maniacal sneer of 20th century schizoid man, embraced their own genre, Edwardian rock. And Steve Hackett was a huge King Crimson fan, and he mentions in his autobiography how much he enjoyed going to see King Crimson play at about this time, and especially the sound of the mellotron. In fact, I think it was Hackett's idea that the band incorporate a mellotron into their sound, and he purchased a fire-damaged one from Robert Fripp. And these were not cheap instruments at the time. And this instrument adds a palpable sense of melancholy, a sense of the uncanny amid these dark Victorian forays that are imbued with a genuine sense of prog pageant and majesty. We get a series of mini suites, of course, that involve croquet mallet decapitation, the prospect of the coming apocalypse, spearheaded by some toxic vegetation, and cautionary tales drawn from Greek myth, all embodying a certain theatricality, suggesting the shifting topography of the prog landscape. As I said before, Anthony Phillips departs the band and we get the famous four-man Genesis. They do, however, play some shows with newly recruited drummer Phil Collins, before being joined by new guitarist Mick Barnard, who I believe wrote most of the parts for the musical box, especially the second part at least. The first half is attributed to the aforementioned Phillips. By the time Steve Hackett joins, I think the musical box is almost in the can, so to speak, but what he does add is some interesting guitar flourishes and motifs, especially those little guitar moments that emulate or evoke the sound of a musical box. Apparently I read somewhere that Mick Barnard was actually asked to leave the band due to his lack of proficiency on a 12-string guitar. And the band embarked on a tour, a sort of a package tour if you like, with a group together with a Lindisfarne and Van de Graaff generator. It was part of the Charisma 6-bob a ticket show, really. Genesis got the third billing, believe it or not. The band play a show in Belgium at this juncture. For some reason, they have a huge following in Belgium, and there was actually a live recording of a gig they did about this time, which actually features the first performance of the song The Light, a song that would, of course, later morph into Lily White Lilith from the wonderful Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So let's think of the tracks on this album. Of course, we get Musical Box. This track has its origins in 1969. Anthony Phillips had come up with the acoustic intro. The working title for this song was F Sharp. But it was at this point that the band were asked to contribute some incidental music to a BBC documentary on the artist Mick Jackson. And as a lot of the paintings of Mick Jackson were a tad racy, some commentators have added this perhaps adds to the sexual tension and nuances explored in some of the themes of this music. Certainly the dark sexual undertones of the musical box lyrics. And this song is a broth that has way too many chefs. I think it actually has a 7-man writing credit for this one. This macabre tale sees little Henry decapitated by Cynthia with a croquet mallet. She discovers this musical box. Of course, she opens it and out pops Henry's spirit, who rapidly ages. Yet, despite his advancing years, he still desires to slip it to Cynthia. Apparently, the nurse enters and kills Henry by heaving the musical box at his head. A strange Victorian Gothic tale full of menace and psychosexual frenzy. And if we compare this to the previous record, it's like stepping out of the sunshine of the Trespass album into the darker shadows of Victorian fairy tales and all the menace, of course, that evokes. For Absent Friends has some similarities to Blood on the Rooftops. It has the same writing credit, I believe. Hackett's music being beautifully accompanied by Phil Collins' lyrics. Gabriel was the only member of the band to be completely absent from this one. It paints a typically sort of English scene as two elderly ladies visit church and reminisce over their lost husbands, days when they were 4 instead of 2. Interestingly, Collins' vocal style is hushed and understated, suiting the subdued, melancholic refrain of the piece. Collins has actually confessed that he thought he was joining a Crosby, Stills Nash type band when he joined Genesis. In fact, Jonathan King actually gave Genesis albums by Crosby, Stills Nash to listen to before their first album. But this song structurally serves the function of providing some light, really, for the darker shades of the more epic pieces that fall either side of it. And what is intriguing about this is its use of unrhymed poetry, and the effect that has is it shifts the emphasis to detail and narrative rather than having to adhere to some strict metrical pattern. And the dual acoustic guitars beautifully platform Collins' voice that is imbued with this sense of sentiment and affection for the subjects of the song. Heads bent in prayer for friends not there. As I said, this song is beautifully placed between the dark majesty of the musical box and the harder, edgy arrangement of Return of the Giant Hogweed. Ultimately a song that has a whiff of loneliness to it, very reminiscent of Eleanor Rigby. Return of the giant hogweed. Now this was a plant that was introduced to Britain in the 1800s and soon spread wildly across the country. The plant itself did have a horrific sting that would result in blistering, blindness and even possible death. A bit like masturbation in that respect, I guess. And Tony Banks runs his electric piano for this fuzz box, which adds this dizzying sense of urgency as we're alerted to the fact that the giant hogweed is about to conquer Britain. The story of plant infestation doesn't quite live up to its satiric possibilities, which may well be true, but I think it's classic Genesis nevertheless. Apart from the musical box, this is ultimately the highlight of this album. And Hackett plays his guitar like a keyboard, incorporating that famous tapping technique appropriated by Hackett, not invented by him. This is certainly an oddball piece and an exercise in a kind of a quirky melodicism, and the point of view alternates between those that want to stamp it out. We hear their voices. They are invincible. They seem immune to all our herbicidal battering. And of course the narrator, who tells the backstory in long winding sentences. Long ago in the Russian hills, a Victorian explorer found the regal hogweed by a marsh. He captured it and brought it home. And finally we get a piece entitled The Dance of the Giant Hogweed. The victory cry of the hogweed themselves. Mighty hogweed is avenged. Human bodies soon will know our anger. Kill them with your hogweed hairs. What a very English and eccentric piece this is. Seven Stones would not feel out of place on the Trespass album. It's this series of little allegories. Its lyrics tell of three narratives. Seven Stones was actually originally issued as a B-side to Happy the Man, and many have suggested it paints a similar picture to the song Chamber of 32 Doors from the Lamb album. The opening line, I heard the old man tell his tale, puts it very much in storyteller mode, which soon becomes a mix of these rather incomplete mysteries that we have to sort of pick at and derive a modicum of moral and eternal truth from. One critic said there's something distinctly Brothers Gibb about this before it veers off into more symphonic prog territory. The use of its colossal dramatic chord changes and the odd backing vocals. Harold the Barrel is perhaps Gabriel's first attempt at sort of comedic storytelling. One can feel the palpable sense of enjoyment that he and Collins had making this as their voices are merged into one. The use of the Mockney accent as well, it has something reminiscent of the old Ealing comedies, but sonically, thematically it's rather pertinent as it represents that dark Victorian underworld with its Punch and Judy vocal style, as we're greeted with these rather macabre narratives like the restaurant owner that cuts off his own toes and serves them to his family for tea, and the choppy and clunky rhythms adds to the discomfort of the listener, as well as some of the lyrics as well. The track Harlequin was written by Mike Rutherford, and it wouldn't feel out of place on the Trespass album, although he has recently gone on to reject this song, which is a shame really, because it doesn't feel out of place with the enthusiasm for folk that existed in the very early 70s, no doubt fanned by the flames of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. This song would sometimes replace Happy the Man as the show opener for their live set at this time, as the band liked to start with quiet numbers, then build up to the heavier ones as the set progressed. And then we get the mighty Fountain of Salamassus. Like the musical box, of course, it originates in music commissioned for the BBC documentary on Mick Jackson. Interestingly, Ray L, who I've already mentioned, suggests, if I may quote, that this song, its lyrics bear all hallmarks of young men more versed in the world of geography, history, mythology than sex, drugs and rock and roll. Nevertheless, it's a strange and eerie tale of a sexual merging. The version of this myth that I understood was much, much darker. It actually involved the nymph Salamassus raping the young boy. But what we get with this number is this superficial symbolism of unity, described by one critic as more Soviet than sexual. For all its shortcomings, I do actually love the arrangement of this. I mean, Tony Banks' arpeggio is around about the 3:15 mark, and Hackett's sublime closing guitar solo is almost the cigar and cognac of the piece, really, as the mellotron slowly fades out. This song and many others on this album suggest a soft English pastoral quality, before that sort of transmogrifies horribly into nostalgia and is given the ironic treatment on the beautiful selling England by the pound. Anyway, you've been watching a review by Classic Album Review. I hope you enjoyed that, and indeed enjoyed this wonderful, wonderful Genesis album. I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope that you're staying well and safe. And of course, more importantly than that is that you keep listening.